Hello, my name is Martin Brown, and this is going to be a very simple introduction to manual photography. You can get into manual mode on your camera pretty easily. Wherever you select your mode, it's usually presented by a letter M, but you want to be in manual mode rather than automatic. So you're picking the settings. The reason we're doing manual mode is so you pick the settings, and later on, I'm going to explain why that is important. So once you get into manual mode, there's three settings you're going to need to worry about: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So they're the only three things that we're going to cover today. We'll start with ISO, and we're going to put these two images side by side. So when you're starting, it doesn't matter what your settings are, just take a picture. And that's what I've done with this image on the left here. And as we can see, our settings are ISO 400, our aperture, which is measured in f-stops, is f4, and our shutter speed, which is measured in parts of a second, or seconds if you have it slow enough, is 1/400th of a second. So this image on the left is going to be our base image for everything that we look at. So 400 ISO, f4, 400th of a second, all the fours, doesn't matter, just random settings. So from here, which is not a very well exposed image because it's very, very bright in a lot of these areas. So we're going to fix this up. Firstly, using ISO. ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light, to put it simply. The lower your ISO, so ISO 400 is quite low, the darker your image is going to be, but the quality is also going to be better. So you want your ISO as low as possible. We are on ISO 400 at the moment on this image. On this image on the right, which is the image I took directly after this one, we are on ISO 200. So that on this right hand image, the camera is less sensitive to light, purely because of what we've told it, changing the ISO. So as you can see on the left image, 400 ISO, the surface of the ball is very, very bright. There's no detail in that. On the right here, we can see ISO 200 is better. The colors coming back into the image, we've got a little bit more detail. So that's definitely on the right track. And if we move one more to the next photo I took, ISO 100. All the other settings are the same. The aperture and the shutter speed are the same. ISO is the only thing we've changed, and as we can see here, everything's looking a lot better. This is much more what we want. The color's back. As you can see on the left, all that bright area is now colorful again. This is a usable image on the right. We could use that quite easily. And basically that's how ISO works. Is the lower you have it, the darker the image is going to be, but the better the quality. So if you need to go higher on the ISO, you're going to get a little bit more noise coming in. That's the other aspect of ISO, is the quality versus the noise. So low ISO, high quality, high ISO. As you go higher, you're going to start struggling with noise, but it's not going to be a problem until you're into very high ISOs like 6400 or 8000 is perfectly usable on my camera. Yours may be different. It depends on what camera you're using. Right. As you can see, ISO 800, just to show the point, is even brighter than ISO 400, and you've even lost the little dots here. They've gone out of the image because it's so bright. That's definitely not usable. Right, so now we're going to start changing different things. So these images are different images, but they're both taken at exactly the same settings. So ISO 400, aperture f4, and shutter speed 1/400th of a second. Now we're going to start changing aperture. So aperture is the opening in the lens, and it's going to dictate the amount of light. It's literally changing the aperture is changing the size of the opening that light is coming through. So if the next photo is taken at f2.8, and as you can see, if we compare them close up, that the aperture f4 image on the left here is much better than the aperture 2.8 image on the right, purely because at 2.8 the aperture is larger, so there's more light coming in, and we don't want that because we're trying to darken this image on the left. It's too bright. So we've gone the wrong way there. So all we need to do is bring it back. So you go back to f4 in this left image, then we've gone to f8 in the right image. f8 is a narrower aperture, so we've reduced the size of the hole that light is coming through into the camera, and therefore we've reduced the brightness of the image. So we can see this is much better. You could potentially use this image on the right. So all we've changed there, the ISO is still 400, the shutter speed is still 1/400th of a second, but the aperture is now f8, and we can keep going from there. And every time we increase that aperture, increasing the number of the aperture is obviously narrowing the aperture. So f11 is smaller than f8, so there's less light coming in. f16, smaller again, less light coming in. So we can keep going there, and it will get darker every time. f22, much too dark. So really, f11 is okay. f11 is probably the best image there. So we can get a properly exposed image, which means that the image is correct brightness, correctly presents the object in the image, is probably at f11 there. We'll go back to the original image. So this is a separate image again, but exactly the same settings, ISO 400, f4, and 400th of a second. And now what we're going to do is we're going to change the shutter speed. So that's the only thing we're changing in these images. So we've started at 400th of a second. So that's the fraction of a second in which this image is taken. It's very quick. But to us, it's very quick. 400th of a second is nothing. But for the camera, it can be quite, that's actually not a huge shutter speed, and we'll see that later. So if we reduce the shutter speed, so it's slower, so the shutter is remaining open for longer, even though it's still just 1/200th of a second, we can see that it's going to brighten the image quite a lot, because you're allowing the shutter to stay open for longer. So more photons are hitting the camera's sensor, and we're going to get a brighter image, which we don't want because the image is already too bright. So we're going to change that up again. This is exactly the same as the first image. So 800th of a second is what this shutter speed is now. This one is still 400th of a second. So we can see we're getting there. There's still quite a bright area here, which is much too bright. So we can go further with the shutter speed. So every time we increase the shutter speed, we're decreasing the amount of time that the shutter is open. So here we see a much better image at 1/1600th of a second, and that starts to become a usable image because the ball is now much better exposed. We can keep increasing that. 3,200th of a second, which is very quick, and that when it loads. That's much better than the original image we've got. But the important thing is that you start somewhere. So this image here, you have to start somewhere. So you might as well take an image that's overexposed or underexposed. Overexposed means too bright, underexposed is too dark. So just take an image and work from there. And you know now the 3 things that you can change to make that image better, more correctly exposed. This image is taken at 6,400th of a second, is starting to get too dark. So that's probably a better image. So ISO 400, f4, and 1/3200th of a second. That one's gone even darker. This is taken at 800th of a second, 8,000th of a second, sorry. So very quick. And we're starting to lose a little bit of the detail. So we're going to switch this image now, and just quickly, there we are. So this image on the left, we've got a different subject now. We've got a leaf, or selection of leaves, is taken at an arbitrary set of settings. So we've got 400 ISO, our aperture is f4, and our shutter speed is 400th of a second. So it's quite a fast shutter speed, and we can see here it's lovely and crisp, really nice focus on the leaves here. That's a decent image. We could use that. Next to it, we have changed the setting. We've only changed one setting. Oh no, we haven't. We've changed 2 settings. So we've changed the ISO to 100. So we've made the image darker there, but we've also reduced the shutter speed quite considerably, from 4,000th of a second to 160th of a second. So what that's resulted in, changing those 2 settings, is an overexposed image. But the next photo, we know that all we have to do is change the shutter speed back up again. And that is pretty much the same image as the one on the left. But it's completely different settings. So this image is taken at ISO 400, aperture f4, and our shutter speed is 4,000th of a second. But on the image on the right, it's ISO 100, aperture is still the same at f4, and our shutter speed is 640th of a second. But you can see the images look pretty much identical, because they're both correct exposures but taken at different settings. And that's really why you want to be in manual mode, is because you then have control over the image. So we can show you why you might want to do this. So if you want the leaves in the background to be a bit more visible, here they're quite blurred out, and that's because the wider your aperture, the more blurred the background is going to be. It's called depth of field. So if you have a very wide aperture, you're going to have a narrow depth of field. So the only thing in focus is what you've immediately focused on. And then everything in the background is going to be quite blurry. So if we want to see those leaves in the background more, we're making a choice that we want to see the leaves in the background more. We're going to have to turn the aperture up. We're going to need a narrower aperture, a larger aperture number, but a narrower aperture. So f11 that we saw earlier, f22 maybe. This image, we've done that on the right. So we've gone to f16. I'm just going to change this image on the left. So it's this one, because that's close. So The only thing we're changing is the aperture between these two images. This is f4, f16. But we've obviously got a problem in that this image at f16, the leaves in the back are still more visible, but the image is too dark now. So we don't want to change the aperture again because we already have the desired effect, but we do want to brighten the image again. And there's an easy way to do that. All we need to do is from here to here is to change that shutter speed. So we're now on 160th of a second. From 640th of a second, we're now at 160th of a second. And that's getting there. That's starting to look better. We don't really want to go lower than 160th of a second if we hand holding the camera, because if you do that, you're likely to start getting motion blur because of the slower shutter speed. So we're going to change the ISO instead. So here we have the original image. It's almost there. It's almost there. We've brought the ISO up to 800 from here at 100. So we're starting to get there. As you can see, the leaves in the background are much more visible. So this is probably a good area to show it. When the right image loads, there we are. So in the left image, aperture f4, very blurred out background. f16, not so much. So we're almost there. This is still a little bit too bright though. So we're gonna change the aperture again. So we want the leaves a bit more in focus. So we've gone f32 now. So that's a really narrow aperture compared to f4. f4 is very wide aperture, so lots of light coming in. f32, very narrow hole for all the light to come in. So obviously the image becomes darker. But it's a bit too dark now. So we're going to fix that by changing the ISO. And I do this because I've been doing it for so many years. I do this instinctively. So I change the settings as I go to hone the image. But here we can see these images are pretty much identical in exposure. Maybe the right one's a little bit darker. But the detail in the background is much more visible. And this is the control that using manual mode allows, is that you can choose how your image looks. If you want those leaves in the background, but your camera in automatic mode is taking the image on the left, you need to be able to know how to change that image in manual to get those leaves in the background if you want them. And that's the control that manual photography allows, and it's why it's much better for creative work. There we go. That's pretty much the same. So all I've done between these two images is changed the ISO a little bit higher. So it will be a little bit brighter, and I say that's pretty spot on. So it's exactly the same exposure. The images look pretty much identical, but this image is taken at ISO 100, f4, and 1/640th of a second, whereas this image is taken at ISO 1600, f32, and at 1/60th of a second. They're the same image, they're pretty much the same exposure to the eye, but we've taken them in two completely different ways, and that essentially is the control that you want from manual photography. Thank you very much.